Hi guys, this is Asal. I'm studying for the bar and I wanted to review my notes with you. So today I'm studying evidence and I'm studying the privileges rule. First of all, I would like to define privilege for you. So the privileges are rules that keep certain type of evidence out of court based on the relationship between the parties, and also privileges protect confidential information against disclosure. So the privilege that I'm talking about today is the spousal privilege, and the spousal communication privilege protects confidential communications, and the spousal immunity privilege allows refusal to testify. So what do I mean by confidential information? That is something that is private or intended to be confidential. And what do I mean between spouses? What I mean by that is the two people must be married at the time of the communication. So if they're not married at the time of the communication, it does not apply. And the next thing is the assertion and the waiver. So the privilege is asserted by either spouse, and the communications may not be disclosed. Also, privilege may be waived by both spouse and communications may be disclosed. So as long as both spouse they waive it, then communication will be disclosed. And as long as either spouse asserts the privilege, communication may not be disclosed. So that's how it works. And then the next thing is spousal immunity privilege, married at the time of trial and criminal trials. And also there's the exception to the spousal privilege. So where do we have that exception? We have that exception when we have adverse parties or joint crimes or crime against spouse or child. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if the spouse are now divorced and they're adverse parties, then that's an exception there. Or if there's a joint crime where these two spouses, they decide to be Bonnie and Clyde and they go rob a bank. So that's a joint crime over there. And then the next thing is the crime against spouse or a child. So in a case of child abuse, there's another exception here. If one spouse is abusing the child, beating the child up, the exception applies. And then the next thing is the spousal immunity privilege. This is again the crime against spouse or the child. And then the next thing I would like to talk about is how spousal communication privilege and spousal immunity, they come hand in hand sometimes. So there's that overlap. So I'm doing this so that you see how they can overlap with each other. And the next thing, I would like to actually read this paragraph for you because this is the general rule. It says the general rule is that the spouse of a criminal defendant may not be called as the witness by the prosecutions, nor may the married person be compelled to testify against his spouse in any criminal proceeding. Okay, so it has to be a criminal proceeding. And then the next thing is time limit on assertion of privileges. So the spousal immunity privilege can be asserted only during a valid marriage, okay? The right to assert the privilege expires upon divorce or annulment. Also, the next thing is, what do I mean by a confidential marital communication? I mean communication made between spouses while they were married. So between spouses while they were married, this is privileged if the communication was made in reliance of the sanctity of marriage. So if they're relying on the sanctity of marriage and they're sharing their secrets, so that applies here. Also, the next thing I would like to talk about is the scope of privilege. So this privilege only applies to communications made during marriage, and this applies to both civil and criminal. Okay, and the last thing is the lack of time limit on assertion of privileges. So the time for asserting this privilege extends to beyond the termination of the marriage. And I would like to conclude this video by talking about waivers one last time. So a waiver, a privilege may be waived if the person who holds the privilege fails to assert the privilege in a timely manner. 2, voluntarily discloses or allows another another to disclose a substantial portion of communication to the third party unless disclosure is privileged. And 3, or contractually waives the privilege in advance. So in these 3 cases, if they fail to assert the privilege in a timely manner, if they voluntarily disclose, or if they contractually waive the privilege, then that's a waiver right there. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about, and I really hope you enjoy studying. Good luck.